It's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is actually the second time I've given this, but it's new and improved because we've added a lot more things I've learned as I've been giving the show throughout the Cape over the past year and a half, in lots of different towns. I've tried to make this one a little more Falmouth-centric for you all because I know it's very difficult for people at this end of the Cape to have much concern for what's going on at the other end of the Cape and vice versa. But we are all in this together. It's a very fragile place, as you know. And things that happen, natural resource protection does not recognize town boundaries, as we know. Think of the plumes coming out of the base and affecting 4 different towns in the aquifer. But it's called A History and a Future because it's my interpretation. It's not the history or the future. But I've tried to include some of the themes that I think are important as we look at this. And it's a very short history. You know, if we did a history of fishing on Cape Cod, it would go back 400 years and then 10,000 years of people shore whaling and cod fishing and everything else. But land conservation is really only 130 years old. We didn't need to worry about setting aside land for conservation until the land became overrun with people. That's one of the themes that you'll see here, is this that sense of loss of open space and openness and landscape character on the Cape that made people anxious. And anxiety led to action, as you will see. And no more here so than in Falmouth, of course. The rallying cry, 300 acres for the 300th anniversary of the town, and beat Barnstable. I mean, that was a big rallying cry. So, but nothing wrong with a little anxiety, get people to move, and as you'll see, a lot has been accomplished. So this is not the Falmouth Men Club. These are the old white guys sitting down in 1961 at the president's desk, and you know, of course, what he's doing. Yeah, the Cape Cod National Seashore Act. And I've been trying to crowdsource who all these people are. So far, we've only come up with Stuart Udall, and in the back there against the window, Tip O'Neill. Anybody else? Pick out anybody from?
The gentleman on the left, Steve Smith on the left.
This guy?
Family member married to one of the candidates.
Steve Smith, yeah.
Steve Smith.
Okay, that's good to know. How are we doing for sound? Is this? I don't feel like this is actually working. It's okay? Okay, great. Yes, so President Kennedy signed the Cape Cod National Seashore Act. That in itself was the biggest single thing done for open space protection on the Cape, but it was not enough. And so what we're going to talk about is some of the other things that have been done. And of course, we have to recognize that people were preserving Cape Cod in a very sustainable way for thousands and thousands of years. Here are the people of the First Light, the Wampanoag tribe, and we're glad that they're still here with us and sharing their knowledge with us as well. So I talked about the fact that this is a short history, and there are some antecedents, as we'll see, but this I want to come back to, as you'll see a couple times. In 1891, a state legislature passed something called the Trustees of Public Reservations Act. And that was the first land trust in the world. It actually predates the National Trust of Britain. It was a specific nonprofit organization chartered by the state government to find museum-quality landscapes and publicly accessible spots and set them aside against development and for public enjoyment. And so they hired initially this geographer from New Hampshire, Mr. Harrison, and they gave him an assignment of visiting all the seacoast shores in Massachusetts. And he spent most of his report talking about Cape Cod. And he fell in love with Cape Cod, as you can see. But he also had a warning for Cape Codders, that if you do not set aside some land, you're going to become just like the cities that people are trying to escape from. 1892 was his report. The same could be said in 1992 and probably 2092. So Mr. Harrison kind of led the rallying cry for we got to do something about we're losing the shores of Massachusetts. So why do we want to preserve open space? Because it's the setting, it's the natural resource base for all the things we think are important to protect. If you want to have clean water, you have to save the land around it. You think of your Long Pond Reservoir. It's important to add on to the land up gradient draining down into the pond. And the 300 Committee in the town are working this year to preserve another 3 or 4 acres on the upside of, is that Brick Kiln? What is that? What's the road there? Brick Kiln Road? Yeah. So it's important to go to town meeting and vote for that when it comes up this spring. We also want to make sure that we're saving farmland. We have Farming Falmouth here. Right now they're raising money to save an important piece on Locust Field Road. We also want to have wildlife habitat, so we have to preserve open spaces for our very important wildlife here on the Cape. So many species have come back just since I've lived here year-round in the last 45 years, when you think about it, and culminating, of course, in our bald eagles. You know, who would have thought I would have lived long enough to see a bald eagle nest on the Cape? There's a nest at the top of Middle Pond on Race Lane and Marston's Mills if anybody wants to go look for it. And scenic views, of course. A lot of people approach their passion for environmental protection because something looks beautiful. Think of the Knob. Think of the views from the Knob. I mean, it's one of the most important views on the Cape. Sunsets at the Knob. What a place to get married. Anybody here get married at the Knob? Okay, well, maybe your grandchildren will. Hiking trails, recreation. Falmouth has done a great job of linking up trails, particularly up through the Moraine Trail, the Long Pond up to Hatchville, a series of linked walking trails for the public to enjoy. But I talked about antecedents, and so here's one. It's not based on environmental protection. It was based on economic protection. The dunes of Provincetown were being denuded by the colonists, and the sand was getting up and blowing away, as sand likes to do when it's not anchored with roots and trees. And so to save the harbor and the fishing fleet, as early as 1700s, the town was taking action to make sure that those dunes would not be completely denuded. And in fact, most of them now have a good anchor of woods coming back in. This is the one place off of Snail Road. Has anybody walked up that trail from Snail Road? See, Falmouth people, you got to get out more, right, Emily? And more visionaries, forecasting what can happen if we don't take care of our environment. Here's our old friend Henry David Thoreau coming down several times in the 1840s and 50s to walk along the shores of the Cape and finding that the Cape was basically looking like the ocean laid bare because of all the cutting down of trees, because it was a wood-based economy for many decades and centuries, even into the last century. The Cape was very much denuded. And we still are cutting down trees, of course, for commercial and residential development. Large cellar holes for ever larger houses, taking out the forest. We're also cutting down forest for ground-mounted solar arrays. We've got some great examples of canopy solar arrays, like here at the county fairgrounds, but not at the Falmouth Mall, not at the Cape Cod Mall. They should have solar canopies, shouldn't they? So that we're not cutting down forests for them. And of course, for subdivisions. During the 1980s, the fastest growing part of New England was Cape Cod. Mashpee was the fastest growing town in New England. And just whole swaths of forest being cut down. Here you see one where we couldn't save one tree in the 15 acres. What is it, 15 acres? No, we're going to bring in nursery stock. Do you know what the number one crop on the Cape is now? It's not cranberries. It's not strawberries, Falmouth. It's nursery stock. That's what we grow the most of for the landscaping.
Privet.
Huh? Privet. And I'm guilty. I planted a, Leland cypress. Totally useless tree. Grows fast. I had to cut it down within 15 years. So let's go back to Professor Harrison. So this is what he found as he walked around the Cape, that there were no public accessible spaces. Now, in 1892, maybe that wasn't as much of a problem because it was a very sparse population. People were neighbors and friends and relatives. They just wandered around the landscape and nobody really bothered them. But he thought it was important to have access to the shore. That's what he was hired to do, and he just couldn't find things. So what did he find in Falmouth? No public holding except a town landing. I wonder which one it was. But anyway, I mean, it's just it's a travesty to think that as late as the late 1800s, we hadn't had the foresight to set aside some places to get down to the shore legally. At that same time, and perhaps as a result of his report, the state legislature set aside thousands of acres of the province lands. This was land of the province of Massachusetts before it was even a state. It was set aside as a commons for the fishing community particularly. And so this was the first official designation of a set-aside by the state government on the, and it got subsumed into the National Seashore course by 1962. So what I want to talk about in the early part of the last century were a little bit of noblesse oblige, where private individuals exercising individual decisions to do charitable acts to create small parks for the residents to enjoy. And so I call these the one-off conservation deals, where people like Joseph Fay, a Boston resident who came down to Woods Hole, and we still have Fay Road. Isn't there a Fay estate still down there? But he said, I thought the people of Falmouth were so nice to me that I want to extend my goodwill back to them, and made Goodwill Park. Where that is, right near Long Pond. So, the town would have to accept that as a gift, and they did, and they've added on to it, and it's one of the nicest places to go and look at the water, as close to downtown as it is. Proto-land trusts, I call them, the village improvement societies. So these were civic associations that wanted to acquire some parcels of land to set aside as public parks. We didn't have many town greens and commons. Your town common is only there because the church burned down and they didn't rebuild it. And so the town decided to make it a park. It was not laid out originally as part of the town's establishment. And so when I gave this talk in Eastham, a history professor came up to me afterwards and he says, do you know why that is, that the Cape didn't have intentional town commons, village greens? And when you think about the original settlements, Barnstable, Yarmouth, Dennis, all the way out, you don't find them. And he said the difference was between Plymouth Colony and the Bay Colony. So the Bay Colony in Boston, if you wanted to set off a new town, like Needham or Stowe or whatever, you came to the general court, the legislature, and the governor. You said, we want to start a new town. And they said, you need three things. You need a minister, a church, and a common. And so if you have those three things, you can have a town, and we'll establish the boundaries for it. There was none of that in Plymouth Colony. It was kind of a free-for-all. Just go down there and settle and see what happens. But they had to get, of course, permission from Plymouth to do that. But they didn't set aside these greens. So these little village associations came forward and made them in Eastham and also in Dennis. And the Dennis Village Improvement Society is just acquiring another piece of land across the street, 1 acre for $1.5 million. Wow. Thank you very much. 1 acre. Crazy. So, more private philanthropy. Selectmen, and they called them selectmen at the time, Bodfish and Barnstable, all of Sandy Neck, 6 miles long, Barrier Beach, the most beautiful beach on the bay. But there was no legal public access to it. And he owned some of it as part of his farm. He gave 2 acres to the town. The town has since added on to it. Interesting story about Sandy Neck. In the late 1950s, the state did a study to recommend where the next state beaches should be. Things like Horseneck Beach in Westport, And they recommended Sandy Neck should be a state beach. And the town came to the state and said, no, no, no. If anybody's making money off of that beach, it's going to be the town, not the state. And so the town assembled the dunes as by eminent domain and cleared the titles, and they've added on to it since, but it's a magnificent place. So, beaches and birds and botany, those are the themes that drove people. It wasn't protecting groundwater or rare species. It was for things that people could understand as part of their natural heritage. So, public access to the beaches, preserving birds and bird habitat, as at Wellfleet with the Audubon Sanctuary out there, and flowers. The first public park dedicated to botany over there in Osterville was a county horticultural society, recently merged with the Trustees of Reservations, which now manages it. And by the 1930s, of course, we were starting to develop a tourist economy. And as a result of the automobile coming down, we had to put the macadam on the roads. And you can see this, the tourist auto map of Cape Cod. So they're showing people from away, we have these nice roads here now. You don't have to drive in the sand anymore. We put down the oil and the tar so that you're not going to sink up to your hubs in the sand. But even then, the Chamber of Commerce was scratching their heads and say, we want to bring these people down, and it's better for the economy. We got money in the pocket of the innkeepers and the merchants. But we got to be sure that we're not going to kill the golden goose. And similarly, a foresighted editor in Chatham said that we really should have a national park for that part of the Cape that bends out to Provincetown. It's where the most splendid scenery is. And it was about preserving scenery. It wasn't about preserving water supplies or anything else at that time. So some more private philanthropy, the Nickerson State Park, which is the most popular campground on the state. It used to be that on midnight on January 1st, you had to be at your computer clicking a reservation. It's kind of like the Steamship Authority to get a campsite because it was so popular and is so popular still. Renovation of bomb sites. So we know, for instance, No Man's Land, the island off of Aquina on the Vineyard, has been turned into a wildlife refuge. Similarly at Monomoy, which is the only national wilderness area in Massachusetts. After they got done bombing it in World War II, they gave it to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Here, you take it. So, and here, back in here in Falmouth with the Crane family. And what's really interesting out there to me is the intentional eco-restoration projects that the state has been doing in the last 15 years, I would say. The old airstrip that was the Coonamessett Airport, Coonamessett Airstrip, I wouldn't call it an airport, but it stretched from Route 151 all the way up to the base, and it was just a grass strip airfield. And so they had this lovely mowed meadow for many, many years, and then it got left alone, and all the pines and cedars started springing up. So the state has intentionally come in and has restored that meadow habitat. It's the largest meadow now on the Cape, a managed meadow for wildflowers, the rare species. The last time I've seen a Bob White quail was on a path here 3 summers ago. I haven't seen one since. I haven't heard one since. Has anybody heard of Bob White in the last few years? Damn it. But thank you to the Crane family for that a bit of charity. And then in the late 1950s, Massachusetts, again, being a pioneer state in many ways and coming up with new ideas. Remember the Trustees of Reservations, the first land trust in the world. By the late 1950s, the state came up with the idea of creating local conservation commissions. So their original purpose was not to do wetlands permitting, like they spend 5 hours a night now, unfortunately, dealing with people who want dock permits and change their house around near the shores and the wetlands. But they were set up to identify and protect the most important natural areas in their communities. And they don't have time to do that anymore. And that's why a lot of local land trusts, like the 300 Committee, have developed to kind of fill that gap and be a supplement to the town's work in preserving open space. So if you can beat me, I appreciate it, but it's 1961, the first time somebody gave land to a town to be preserved, not to be access to a beach or, a park, but to actually be preserved. And it's right there on Route 6A in Brewster. Very nondescript little place. It's not taken care of very well, but they do have a faded sign on it. Back in Falmouth, we had another visionary, again, scratching their head saying, we got to do something about that bare and bended arm on the outer Cape. And here it was Rachel Carson, your own scientist of Woods Hole, who was preaching through national magazines, writing articles, advocating for this. And this was just 2 years before the National Seashore got going. So there they are, the beaming Senator Saltonstall on the right, Republican of Massachusetts senator, and Democratic senator turned president, Jack Kennedy, patting themselves on the back for having created the Cape Cod National Seashore. And I don't discount what they did, but it was not their idea. It was those two guys' idea. If you read Tip O'Neill's biography, Man of the House, he has a chapter. He said the thing that he was most proud about in his career was creating the Cape Cod National Seashore legislation. And his roommate, Eddie Boland, they were roommates in Washington, D.C., even though they were both married, came back from a dedication of a national seashore in the Carolinas and said, Tip, we should do something like this for Cape Cod. And Tip said, okay, write a bill, and I'll work on it with you. And so they had their staff, who had Cape connections, and this was Saltonstall's staff and primarily, to come up with something unique. Again, a uniqueness of Massachusetts and the Cape. Instead of creating a national park in an area like out west that was uninhabited except for the original inhabitants, how do you create a national park in and amongst all these 300-year settled towns like Wellfleet, Truro, Eastham, Orleans, Provincetown? And so they came up with the idea of zoning for it, creating a national seashore zoning district, which all of the towns adopted and has been more or less faithfully preserved. But these characters, both attorneys, have amazing backgrounds. Jonathan Moore later became the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. David Martin has an association with Sandy Neck, cottage out there. He's from the Luce family of Time Life Publishing. But this is what they did. They came up with the legislation that Tip O'Neill, our Congressman Hastings Keith here on the Cape, Eddie Boland, Saltonstall, and Kennedy finally pushed. Now, Kennedy was late to the party. He was afraid that there was too much controversy over this because remember, the Cape Codders, independent Yankees, this was socialist takeover of the Cape by the national government to make a national seashore. And so he didn't want to be associated with the controversy. He waited until it got to the end, and then he happily smiled and signed the bill. But not to take anything away from him, but there was a lot of work that went on behind the scenes by a lot of dedicated people, particularly on the Lower Cape. So as you saw Jonathan Moore say, the National Seashore is not enough. We all have to do our part. And by that, it's not just the individual philanthropy, but the group action of coming together as communities through conservation commissions, through town meetings, through nonprofit groups like the village associations and these land trusts that we're getting going. And Henry David Thoreau said if we had a committee that would see that the beauty of the town received no detriment, it would be a good thing. So again, he was very far-sighted in that opinion. So, the town of Dennis was the first to identify collect, negotiate, and vote to purchase with town money, a little bit of federal money at that time, a package of open space parcels. And it was led by Professor Norton Nickerson, who was a botany professor at Tufts, grew up on Bass River, the old Nickerson family. They had chickens during the Depression, and so they called it Nick's Chicks. And their neighbors were the Kellys, Henry Kelly's family, and they had Kelly's Jellies. So it was a competition. But Norton Nickerson led a lady slipper walk behind his house on Bass River every year in the spring. And this is a picture I took when I went with him in the early 90s, I think it was. And it was the biggest profusion of lady slippers anybody had ever seen on the Cape. And so he loved, as a botany professor, to lead people out there. 5 years after he died, all the lady slippers winked out, all gone.
Oh, wow.
Spooky to me, I don't know. They missed Professor Nick. So most of us remember this boom town. Don't have to tell you. I mean, Falmouth grew by 26% in housing stock between 1980 and 1990, much as the rest of the Cape did. And again, it created this anxiety. So the Globe did a poll and said that 3/4 of us wanted to support a ban on some commercial development and even residential construction. So that led to things like the Cape Cod Commission and, as you'll see, the Cape Cod Land Bank. Even before we had the land bank, towns were bringing forward these packages, like the 300 Committee with their 300 plus acres to town meeting for purchase. And the state was now helping us with things like buying Washburn Island, South Cape Beach, and High Head and Truro, a number of other places, adding on to Nickerson State Park, so it had a saltwater beach attached to it. And the biggest one was the Quashnet River acquisition in Mashpee. 350 acres, $10 million. The Ways and Means Committee came to Mashpee to have a field hearing organized by Matt Patrick, Fran Smith, Tom Fudala, and went back to Boston and voted the $10 million. They were so impressed with the support and the character of the land that was thought to be preserved around the Quashnet River. We all can and must do our part, including the 300 Committee. The 300 Club, is that what it is? What is it called, the 300 Club?
We had that all the time.
I know. But, hey, listen, I'm with the Compact of Cape Cod Conservation Trust. What's in a name, right? So very happy to be here to help you celebrate your 40th anniversary. When I was 40, my sister-in-law and I were out sailing, and she looked at me and she said, "We're both 40. Does that feel old to you?" And I said, No, not really. It's old enough to be wise, but young enough to have energy. I feel like now I'm older and wiser, but I don't have the energy. So, and Leonard mentioned the compact. So the idea of the compact was simply all these groups like yours were kind of feeling their way, learning from each other. Let's organize some kind of formal network that we can, learn from each other and hire a guy to sit at a desk and do some work during the week because we're busy during the week and we can only afford to do some weekend work as a volunteer for a lot of these groups. So that was me. I was sitting in the room. There was no nationwide search. I was taking notes and it became a career. So that's but it's interesting that we've now learned that this was the oldest and longest lived regional network of these land conservation groups. As you see, we predate most of the state alliances, except for the national group. And these are just some of the 34 groups that we now work with. We have some more applicants coming to our meeting this time, so you'll hear about them. But open space is not immune to economic trends. And we had October, was it Black Monday in October of '87? Some of you remember that. It was a scary time. And so the towns lost their will to preserve open space. Was it because they didn't have any money? Not necessarily, but they had the lack of anxiety. Nobody was starting new subdivisions in 1987, except the ones that have been on the board. And so people say, well, we don't have to preserve open space. The market's doing it for us. Nobody's building anything anywhere. But as you can see, it started to creep back up. And by the late 1990s, after a couple of failed attempts, people like Vicki Lowell here and Eric Turkington and a lot of other leaders, both volunteer leaders, elected leaders, business leaders, got together and rallied support and passed the Cape Cod Land Bank Act. Every one of the towns on the Cape approved it, some by more of a margin, some less. Interesting to me is the support is greater as you get out farther on the Cape, where you have the National Seashore. They already have the National Seashore. Why are these people voting to tax themselves 3% extra to buy open space? They have the National Seashore. Why? I think it's because people made a conscious decision to move there because they appreciated the beauty and the conserved land and the access to the beautiful ponds out there, and they wanted to have even more of it in their neighborhood, not just out on the seashore. I always look at this map and I say, Falmouth, you're the conservation town. You kind of belong out there with the rest of them. You're the anomaly in the Up Cape. So this led to what I call the golden age of open space protection. About 4,450 acres were purchased Cape-wide.
Wow.
And just a real spasm of activity. And because now we had a steady source of revenue through the surcharge on property tax, each town passed it and approved it and created a 20-year revenue stream to buy open space and just buy open space. The 20 years did not extend all the way through because it evolved and morphed into the Community Preservation Act, which all the towns now have, including Falmouth. And so we now have the surcharge being used to support open space protection, affordable housing, public recreation, and historic preservation. So I can say honestly that in all the towns, I don't know of any open space projects that went wanting for the lack of funding in competition with these other sectors. So the commitment is still there, even though the funding source is different. We talked about the Community Preservation Act. You can see the parcels in blue there that were scattered all over the Cape, but that's the 4,500 acres that were purchased. And although no one of them is as significant as something like Nickerson State Park or Long Pond Reservoir here, they're adding on to it. And it's important to add on to these anchors. By that time, we were also worried about the future of the base. And again, it took a lot of leaders from Falmouth and the Upper Cape working through the state legislature and getting the governor involved. I think it was Governor Salucci at that time. Vicki, do you remember? No. Yeah, Weldon Salucci maybe. But they set aside 3/4 of the military base to be a water supply reserve and wildlife habitat. There's still training that goes on out there, but it's supposed to be benign training, not cutting down 170 acres of pine woods to create a machine gun range.
That's the red.
Yeah. I don't think it's been funded. Yeah, so you never know with these things, though. So we've almost doubled our open space protection between 1988 and 2018. And I think that, again, that this is a collective effort. Every town's have been involved. The state has helped with subsidies through grants to the towns and to the land trusts. Not as much federal money as you might suspect. It's a good thing we don't rely on federal money because of all the problems going on right now with clawbacks and discontinued contracts and everything else. But the commitment by the locals is still there, and I think that's what's important. Some other emerging things that are innovative here on the Cape, we have the first Native American governed land trust east of the Mississippi, created next door in Mashpee. They're now working not just on the Cape, not just in Eastern Mass, but nationally, helping a tribe recently in Alabama, another one in Wisconsin, to do conservation of important tribal lands. Ramona Peters, there, second from the left, was the founder, and she's still the president. She's an amazing visionary woman who's been all around the world and has come back to Mashpee to set up this group. And in 2015, working with the Dennis Conservation Land Trust, the first cultural respect easement was signed. And this enabled the Native Land Conservancy to gain legal formal access to Dennis Land Trust properties. You say, well, why do they need a document to be signed? If it's open to the public, why can't they go? And the answer is they can. But they don't feel safe on other people's property. Why don't they feel safe? Because as Ramona has told me, if neighbors see three natives in the woods in a circle doing something, they call the police. So these cultural respect easements are things that I think are going to become more important and more popular here on the Cape. And I know your land trust is starting to think about it. It's a wonderful feeling of welcoming people back to some of their original lands. What's interesting to me about this photo of the signing ceremony of the documents was that, you know, I'm there as a notary public. I'm going to stamp the thing and take it across the registry of deeds and do my Eurocentric kind of paperwork. Meanwhile, Ramona had brought ceremonial eagle feathers in a cedar box to waft above the ceremony, which indicates keeping the thoughts at the highest level. And so there's a whole difference in cultures in one photograph, I think. And as Leonard said, things become more complicated. We have to have partners.
Mark specializes in these diagrams.
Yeah. It's my Rube Goldberg of how you fund a $6 million project. You get $3 million of public funds and $3 million of private funds. You preserve 40 acres of barrier beach on Cape Cod Bay, and you rejuvenate a business, a commercial business that grows quahog and oyster seed for the towns and shell fishermen to buy and add to the blue economy. So, but that's how much effort went into organizing all of that. And finally, my most inspired moment was during COVID, where they had outside town meeting, a beautiful October day in Brewster, and everybody voted to spend $26 million they did not have to buy the Cape Cod sea camps. 800 feet of beachfront, the largest parcel left on the largest pond on the Cape, and they bonded that money. It's been so popular that they had to stop selling permits to the in-ground swimming pool on the Bay parcel. So it's just an amazing community resource. They're still planning how best to use it. There'll be conservation restrictions on the pond parcel, and some municipal uses using the old buildings of the sea camps on the Bay parcel. But it was the select board that really led this charge. They did not want to see this sold for development become the next Ocean Edge luxury resort type of development. So, did we save the Cape from all this activity, all this money spent, all this hard work behind the scenes? I leave that for you to make your own opinion. I came from the suburbs. I spent every summer as a kid down here. I watched the Cape develop into the suburb that I left. That's my pessimism, and part of it's from being half Scottish, I think. But I do think that we saved enough of the Cape Cod experiences. And by that I mean the ability to still go out and find a scallop and to catch a bluefish, to hike a trail that's more than 100 yards long. So we have those places. You have to look for them, but they still exist here on the Cape. And people like to look at numbers. I'll just flash through a few numbers. Falmouth is on its way, certainly to 30% of the town in open space, perhaps, by our lifetimes. Well, maybe Jessica's. We're down to the last nitty-gritty. About 14% Cape-wide is left up for grabs. Is it going to be developed? Is it going to be preserved? We can't preserve all of it. We shouldn't develop all of it. We have to find the most important places and make sure those are set aside, and that the less sensitive pieces can be developed, because we need to keep the Cape growing. But we haven't even saved our well fields. Only about a third of the land that protects our well fields, the so-called Zone 2s, are protected. So I'm a water commissioner in Cotuit. We have 2,500 houses that are served on well fields that are only 120 acres. So we don't have room to expand those well fields. We have to protect as much as we can near them. Even our national seashore, there are loopholes, there are variances. People are still building new houses on larger lots in the seashore. So it's a misnomer to think that, misapprehension to think that that the entire national seashore is preserved. There are 600 private parcels in and amongst the 6 towns of the national seashore. So finally, I said I would talk about the future. Well, the future for me is, again, kind of a thematic approach. Undevelopment, eco-restoration, sustainable agriculture, climate resilience, new partners to help us preserve open space, and retaining what we think we have already preserved. So those are the things that I think are important to do for the rest of this century. Undevelopment is simply taking blighted landscapes and creating pockets of beauty. So here's a dilapidated plywood motel in West Yarmouth on Route 28, that strip that nobody likes. But they've done some amazing examples of undevelopment and public space creation. This is the view behind that motel that nobody had ever seen. It's an estuary, beautiful Mill Creek estuary. But tearing down and creating a little park, they're going to have a bridge to connect the 2 parks over the creek, and people will be able to enjoy this view on busy Route 28. Undevelopment on Surf Drive. So after Hurricane Bob, we had some people rebuilding up on stilts. Other people took the buyout that was offered through the federal government, FEMA, working with the town of Falmouth, and creating new public spaces on Surf Drive. So that's sort of 2 different visions of the future when we have these storm-damaged properties, what can happen. Climate resilience, the best thing that land trusts can do, like the 300 Committee, is to preserve land. That's it. Preserve land. That's what you're good at. That's what's going to help the climate respond to the amazing forces that are working against it. And keeping the forest intact. It sounds like a passive thing to do, but it's a great thing to do if you're trying to store carbon and reduce heat in the landscape. Also letting salt marshes migrate inland. If they're all set off by dikes and roads and small culverts, and they don't have a chance to expand into the floodplain, we're going to lose our salt marshes. And of course, that's the nursery for shellfish and finfish. Agriculture, we have great examples here in Falmouth with Tony Andrews Farm, the town working together with the 300 Committee to preserve the land. And the Farming Falmouth has created the largest community garden on the Cape in the rear of the farm. How many plots there now, Ellie?
75.
75?
170 in the whole town.
That's amazing. Congratulations. And the 300 Committee worked with keeping a young farmer on his land, farming, Matt Churchill, the Pariah Dog Farm on T-Ticket, through a conservation restriction, and got a little bit of money from the USDA to help with that. And as I mentioned, Farming Falmouth is now raising money to purchase its first property, a 6-acre farm, and to have a place for the farmer to live on the grounds. So that's an important, we need to save farmers and farming and farmland. And it's all being done here on Locust Field Road. If you're interested in that, see Ellie after the meeting. So we have new partners. We have watershed groups working with us. So Barnstable Clean Water Coalition, very concerned about removing nitrogen from the estuaries. And the headwaters of the Marston's Mills River takes in septic system effluent from about 90 houses. And so if we can, instead of letting those ditches run straight down into the bay, North Bay in Marston's Mills, recreating a natural wetland with nice curvy lines instead of straight ditches, those meanders will settle the nitrogen, let it be taken up by the native plants. And right here in East Falmouth, we have the kind of the flagship property for this type of eco-restoration, taking the old bogs and turning them back into the original freshwater streams and marshes, and maybe eventually back into cedar swamps. Who knows? That's what they were before they were cranberry bogs. They were beautiful white cedar swamps. I hope you've all been able to see that out on, is it Parker Road? John Parker? Yeah. I know the Cape, but I miss a few of the details. I can't get lost. And another partner. So housing groups, how was that a partner? I don't know. I thought you guys were in competition with each other. Well, not in North Falmouth, where the training committee is working with Habitat for Humanity and the town and state grants to cobble together a $6 million purchase. There was an old house that's in not very good shape. That's kind of an area that's already been developed. And the idea is to have Audubon create a new little neighborhood and subsidize the rest of it. What did I say? See, habitat to me means wildlife habitat. Thank you. Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy Carter's group. And so they've already done some projects like this. I know in East Falmouth has been completed. And this would be a new one working together with the 300 committee. So we hope that comes together soon. Retaining open space. I mentioned the machine gun range idea, taking up 180 acres, 170 acres of pine forest, clearing it all out, not for solar fields, but for machine guns. So far, it has not come to fruition. The Association to Preserve Cape Cod has really taken the lead in fighting, beating that back. So thanks to them. Back to our old friend Henry David Thoreau. I think some people call him David. Most people call him Henry. Don't call him Hank. The time must come when this coast will be a place of resort, but this shore will never be more attractive than it is now, 1855. Could have been said in 1955, probably in 2055. But it's because of all this good work that we've been able to save much of the Cape. We haven't saved the Cape. But if there's anything that you need to know, it's that it's only the political will of the people in the towns supporting town meeting votes to keep land in conservation. There's going to be nibbling. Towns are going to come and say, we need a little bit of open space to make a new cemetery or a municipal facility or a DPW barn or a sewage treatment plant. They're going to be coming and they're going to be clawing at your open space if it's not fully protected. That's what's going to happen. It's not just towns. The state is also has lands here that will be looked at as not doing anything. It's just sitting there. We really should be putting it to use better. And so those are the things that you have to be on guard of. So yes, while we want to still preserve the most important pieces, we also want to look in the rearview mirror and make sure that those things that we had protected, thought we had protected, remain protected, so that these two guys can keep running around in open space. They're now 27 and 29. So, thank you.